Thank you so much, Ishan. I'm very happy to be here. As Ishan mentioned, I am currently on sabbatical, which is why I'm trying to do a bit of travel and trying to visit as many people. And I have made it a point to come visit, particularly collaborators that I enjoy working with, such as Ishan. And while I'm not going to talk about the work together today, I'm going to talk about some of the other work I've been working with other actually, it doesn't look like this thing wants to work. All right, I'll just use, nothing wants to work right now. There we go. Oh, here we go. So I just introduced myself again. Just a little bit. So I'm Aviv. I work at the George Washington University in DC, where I'm an associate professor with tenure. I'm currently based in Tel Aviv University for the year for my sabbatical. But before that, I was a faculty member at the United States Naval Academy for 5 years, and before that I was at Swarthmore College, and I did my education at Pennsylvania. And I have a variety of research interests, and particularly in the area of human factors and security, or usable security and privacy. And at GW, we run a lab, which we affectionately call GWUSEC, which is kind of fills the mouth very well. So GWUSEC, here are some people you might recognize in the room. Here is my student Collins, who's sitting up front. He's a little embarrassed for him to be pointed out. But this is us at CCS this year, and then some other members of the lab during peak COVID times. This is my lab in DC, and I'd like to show this that we're really awesome and amazing, and I'm always looking for new PhD students. So if you want to jump across the pond and explore opportunities in the US in any of the topics that I talk about here, I'd be more than delighted to engage in a conversation about that. I also like to talk a little bit about the kind of research we do in the lab. I don't think this is as appropriate for this audience, because I feel like this place has really bought into the idea that humans are an important part of the security lifecycle. But I still think it's worthwhile to kind of remind ourselves of the kind of research that I do and we're interested in. So we're really think about computer security from a human-centered approach, and we're interested in learning why and how users interact, use and misuse security and privacy systems and policies in a connected work, and how do we design better systems as a result of those measures and understandings. And to do this, we have to pull on a lot of different areas of research. Most notably is just human-computer interaction, which is the research of how we think about how users use computer systems more generally, and how do we design interfaces, and how do we work in those fields. But also we draw on areas in social science and psychology, thinking about how social science design and methodology, and how people think about problems and methodologies in that world. And also in my research, I like to draw a lot from system security and applied cryptography, which I have a background in as well. And then you keep going and you think about how the policy and law, in Europe in particular, are very focused in the privacy law space and GDPR, and how all those things play into how users interact in systems, as well as measuring how all this happens more broadly, what really happens in the real world. And you find out when you try and pull all these things together that you really have to take a very broad interdisciplinary approach to work in this space. And I try and do that in my own research and thinking about all the different factors that come into this. And I have a number of different projects that have been influenced by this. So as Yishin mentioned, kind of my bread and butter research that I've been doing for well over a decade now is in the authentication realm. I think I really got into this space thinking about graphical passwords on your, I don't know, I'm actually very curious. How many people how many people use or ever use one of these patterns on their phone to lock their devices? Just a few? More than a few. So this came out when I was in grad school, and I was immediately fascinated by this, and I studied it, and I wrote way too many papers on this topic, and I will never write another one, and I say this out loud knowing that I probably will. And so we did a lot of work in this space, but not only just graphical passwords on mobile devices, but also PINs. We spent a lot of time studying these topics as well. It's an area that's been very fruitful and very interesting to me. But beyond authentication, I've also been doing some research. This is actually research I did with Yishin, thinking about data breaches and how people respond to data breaches. So this is a more common phenomenon in the US, but actually it's a global phenomenon in general that your data is stored on a third party, and that company is breached and that data is released. And how do you as an end user respond to that? Are you even aware of it in any meaningful way? So we ran a number of projects where we had people enter their email address excuse me, into the Have I Been Pwned database and like told them whether or not they've had any breaches and then whether or not they respond to it. Then we actually followed up with them like 6 months later and see if they did anything. And we actually have one more paper that will finally hopefully be published in a couple weeks as well on this topic. And then I've also been working a lot more recently on exam proctoring as well, which is a phenomenon that has come out of the world of COVID really. I mean, it was before COVID, but like came to prominence during COVID, where with the work at home and the remote classroom setting, a lot of schools and universities adopted remote proctoring software, which is you install it on your computer and you would take a test online. Kind of the least, the most benign version of this is that you just have to be on a Zoom with your professor while taking an exam. But the most extreme version of these things would lock down your browser, turn on your camera, track your mouse movements, and all sorts of other kind of very uncomfortable things that are going on. And so we're very interested in like how students and faculty and teachers respond to these devices. We have a number of very active research projects in this space as well. And finally, I'm very proud of the work. This is actually, I'm going to call out my student Collins yet again, kind of led by Collins and his efforts in looking at understudied communities and how they adopt different security and privacy practices. We've done a number of very interesting work, mostly focused in and around Nairobi, and we won a Best Paper Award last year for some of this research. And I'm very proud of all this work, and I like to just talk about it because I'm not going to talk about any of it in the rest of my talk. So I just want to like get it out there that we do a lot of very interesting stuff, but it's not really going to be the focus of this talk. What I'm actually going to talk about today is another line of research that we've been doing in the lab around privacy management and communication. And so I'm going to look at it in kind of like 2 chapters. The first chapter is going to be longer than the second chapter, but we're going to start by talking about privacy dashboards. And these are interfaces that are provided by companies. We'll focus almost uniformly on Google for this as an example, that allow you to look at the data that is collected about you, or at least some view of that data, and then you can then look at it and make decisions about how you want to use it. Like you could delete it, or you could worry about changing your settings going forward, or any of those other notable things. And then a 2-step study that we did, we looked at my activity dashboard, and then we also looked at the advertising settings that come out of that. So like, Google collects data about you mostly for the purposes of advertising to you and learning something specific and doing targeted advertising. And then the second chapter, we'll look at, again about privacy communication and how we like communicate about privacy looking at privacy labels. So these are kind of a relatively recent phenomenon in the App Store, but it's been around as a concept for a while, is to kind of systemize and clearly articulate the kinds of privacy practices of apps and IoT devices and some of these other things to communicate to end users about like, hey, this app will share your data in this way, or will collect this data in this way. So both of these are kind of related around like, how do we communicate to people about the privacy or the practices of their apps and the systems that they use? And kind of fundamentally, the question I'm asking, kind of we're going to come around to this question again and again, what are these things serving? Like, who are they providing information to? Like, in some sense, they're targeted at the end user, but they're also like, in some sense, providing cover and support for the companies that are providing these services. And we'll look at a couple of different studies that kind of reach into that and talk to the heart of that. But before we do that, I want to really give a lot of credit to my student, David. I'm essentially presenting his PhD thesis. Some of these slides, many of these slides were made by David, and I'm like very grateful for him sharing it and letting me tell his narrative of his thesis. He's now currently a professor at University of Richmond, and it's just really great work, and I'm just like very excited to talk about it because I think it's really interesting. But of course, David and I didn't do this alone. There was a lot of other collaborators along the way, so I just want to give credit to where credit's due to students at Mir Masood Ali, who's at University of Illinois, Chicago, Monica Kodwani, Florian Farka, Maximilian Gola, 2 people who came out of RUB. Some of you may know them. Max is currently at CISPA in Saarland, and Chris Kanich, who's a faculty member at University of Illinois, Chicago. So why don't we get started and talk a little bit about privacy management and data dashboards. So I'll just say a lot of the stats and stuff are going to be very US focused, but it's still applicable more broadly. So bear with me as I go through all this. So there is a general consensus, like when you do measurements, that most Americans, at least, really do want to manage their privacy. They're generally concerned about the amount of data that's being collected about them. And so there should be some mechanisms to help them. And when you kind of dive into the detail, a lot of this is that they feel like there's a lack of control over this data, but also they have a lack of understanding of how the data is actually used. And so one of the ways that like companies can help alleviate some of these concerns is actually provide management structures for how users can do this. As I mentioned before, we'll look at two of these. One is the Google My Activity dashboard, and the other one is the Google Ad settings. And the fundamental question that we're asking here is why do users either choose to use these dashboards or not? And more generally, what happens when you ask them to do it? How does that change their perceptions of how data is used about them, right? Are they more concerned? Are they less concerned? Do they see more benefit or do they see less benefit? So let's talk a little bit about what this dashboard actually is. So I'm just curious, how many of you have ever gone to your My Activity dashboard before? A few people. How many, like of those people, how many of you have actually done anything as a result of going to that activity dashboard? Did you delete something? No? Did anyone delete anyone? Did you delete something? You said. So you got very concerned. Yeah. So as you can see, like what is the Google My Activity? It's actually really like a crazy thing. On Google My Activity, you can look at every activity that you did in a Google product. It's really intense. So if you use Chrome, for example, every website you visit will be part of your activity profile that like you type into anytime you type into the terminal. If you have an Android phone, like I do, pretty much every app you open, if you use the Google launcher, like on a Pixel phone, that will be recorded as an activity. So like when you use an app on your phone. If you watch a YouTube video, that will be an activity that will show up in this thing. If you Google a place on your map, right, that will also be looked at a map on your activity. And finally, if you do a search, of course, that is an activity on your phone. So essentially, it's like an extremely rich amount of data about you that Google is more than willing to tell you that they have about you, that you can go and look at. And when you click on a given activity, you can both delete it if you so choose, like if you don't like that activity. You can actually choose to delete activities before some date. You can tell it to not collect certain kinds of activities if you want. There's a lot of things you could do, but mostly this is just a large feed of your life on Google. You and Google, like, you know, walking by the lake hand in hand, right? It's like essentially everything you've done on Google. Yeah, I'm sorry, you had a question?
Well, this only is collected if you're actually logged in, right?
This is what they tell you if it's associated with if you're like on a Chrome logged into your Google account. Yes. But if you have Gmail open, you're logged into your Google account. Yeah, so, and Chrome doesn't work very well if you're not logged into it. One of the results of this study is I stopped using Chrome, just gonna tell you. So anyway, yeah, so it's a pretty intense amount of data, and it's a pretty detailed amount of data. And so what we wanted to know kind of fundamentally is like, okay, so if you had people interact with this, what are their perceived benefits and concerns about data collection more generally? How aware were they of the data collection, and do they have any intent to change their behavior as a result of interacting with this dashboard? So we did what's called a pre and post study design. Actually, yeah. So what we started with is just screening people into the study to see whether or not they had a Google account. It turns out, like, if you do a prolific study in the US to try and figure out who has a Google account, it's like 99.5% of people have a Google account in the US. So pretty much everyone got invited back after we verified they had a Google account. And then from that, we had 153 participants in our main study. And in that main study, they installed a custom browser extension. And that custom browser extension was an app in like the Google ecosystem that then logged into their Google account in the background, downloaded and scanned their Google My Activity so that we can look at specific activities all locally. So we didn't actually look at anyone's individual activities for this study. And locally, that would then insert the data into the study so that we can ask them about specific individual activities, about how they felt about those things, like whether or not they would take action on an individual activity. again, all this happened locally in the browser, so we didn't actually like look at anyone's Google history, but like locally in their browser, the study kind of automatically inserted and managed all this together, which was really interesting. And we did a pre and post study design, which is a study procedure where you ask repeated measures. So you do a before the study, you ask them like a Likert question. We did 2 major Likert questions as our kind of fundamental. And then after, we asked them the same Likert questions with the assumption that the thing that they do in the middle, right, the intervention, is the thing that influences any change. Now, there's, of course, other things can influence those changes, but like it's a fair assumption in a 10-minute, 15-minute study that like the thing you do in the middle is the thing that really changed opinions about it. So in our pre-study, we asked 2 fundamental questions. The first is the concern and benefit scale. So we asked them, how concerned are you with the amount of data Google collects about you, right? Before they've actually seen the amount of data that Google collects about you. And then we asked them, how much benefit do you believe you receive from the amount of data Google collects about you? So what is your perceived concern for data collection, and what is your perceived benefit? And then we did the intervention where we had them first go to the My Activities page, and the browser extension forced them to be on that page for, I think it was 2 minutes, and they had to scroll down some amount in their activities to actually look at the activities that are there. And then we asked them their immediate reactions to those activities, like, what do you think now that you've seen it? And then we presented to them, I think it was 9 activities for them to provide some individual rating, 3 from search, 3 from map, and 3 from YouTube, to like get a sense of like what, how do you feel about these activities? We also chose activities that were 3 months, like recent and 3 months old, 6 months old, and older than 6 months as well, to kind of get some time variety. So after all of this, like review the data that's collected about you, and then we asked them to how they felt afterwards. So a post-exposure, so we repeated the measure that we did before about your perceived concern and your perceived benefit, and then also some other information, their reflections on how much they trust Google to do this, and then they uninstalled the extension and they were logged out of their account as well. So all this happening locally, and then the resulting data we actually analyzed. So if you look at the immediate reactions that people had to looking at their activity, there was a lot of surprise. So like, for example, participant 23 said, I'm surprised at how much data Google collects besides its own sites. I didn't know it saved links you clicked on in a Google search. I'm surprised they were surprised by that, but people weren't really like fully comprehending the amount of tracking that occurs, like telemetry data that occurs in using Google products. Participant 113 said, it's not just what I'm doing with Google, but everything on my phone as well. And participant 45 said, I did not realize they had access to everything that I put into the Chrome bar, which was pretty strong. And if you look at the concern from data collection, we really thought after like looking at this that we would actually see an increase in the amount of concern that people had for the data that was collected. But what we actually found is the inverse to be true. So like a very surprising result. I just want to emphasize how surprising this is. When we asked people to look at the amount of data that they put on their, that Google collected about them, and you ask them beforehand what their initial concern is and what their concern is afterwards, we actually saw a significant decrease in the amount of concern that people had. And you can see this kind of in the shape of the Likert chart, the stack bar chart here, as well as like how people moved up the scale towards less concern overall. And this was significant using a sign ranked or repeated measure test, which was really surprising. We didn't quite understand why that was the case. And then when we looked at the benefits, we also saw the same phenomenon, where as well that we had a significant increase in the overall benefit from Google's data collection. So after looking at this, like we really thought the inverse would be true, that like people would become more concerned and they see less benefit from it. But instead what we saw is less concern and more benefit, which is like a really like counterintuitive, surprising result. And you can actually see what we see overall is 40% of people decrease their concern versus 15% increase, and 29% increase versus 10% decrease. So like what's going on here? Why is this phenomenon going on? So one of the reasons why we think this is happening is that people go and look at their data and they look at it and they're like, well, it's not really that interesting. So I'm concerned about any potentially private information that Google might have about me. And then they go look at it and it's like, yeah, my life is pretty boring. I don't really care if anyone knows anything about me, right? And so like, you go and actually interact with your actual data and like, people just don't care as much as you would expect them to. And similarly, when you see like a reason for change in benefit, like I really haven't noticed many tangible benefits of Google data collection, But then after they're exposed to this, they're like, you know what? That YouTube video that I got recommended, it was pretty good. Like I wouldn't have watched that without Google, right? And so you have this kind of like really counterintuitive result where people, when they engage with their actual data that's collected, they don't have a strong sense of like, this is meaningful information because they see themselves as particularly boring individuals and they don't feel like they have anything to hide. And then they're reminded that like Google, yeah, they actually provide a pretty good service, right? I get a lot of benefit from engaging with Google and getting these YouTube videos. And when I search for that thing late at night that was really random, you know what? I found it, right? And so there's a really this strange phenomenon there where you thought that people, if they use this dashboard, you'd end up having them want to be more engaged with the dashboard. But instead, like you have this kind of inverse effect. And this isn't to say the dashboard isn't effective at providing information to users. After they engaged with the dashboard, people overall said they had a better understanding of the kinds of data that Google collects about them. They also said they're still unlikely to make changes, right, overall to how that data is collected. So there's really a lack of info in decision making that's going on here. People don't have a good sense of what does it mean to actually manage your data using this service. It's not clear what happens when you actually delete your activity or clear your activity. And this lack of additional information inhibits their ability to make decisions. So like if you delete your activity, am I going to continue to receive the benefits from Google that I anticipated? Because it's not really clear, like, do I get these benefits from this data collection or would I get these benefits otherwise? And then as well, users tend to relate inferences with past activity. Oh, so this is actually, sorry, this slide is out of order, but everything I said is true. So what I'm trying to get to is a more larger point, like, are these privacy dashboards actually good for end users? Like a fundamental question. I will posit, without evidence, that they're clearly good for Google, right? It's great for Google. You know, they show you all your data and you're like, that's amazing, here's more, right? But is it actually good for end users to actually manage and take action on their data if they don't have the information or the understanding to actually do the things that they're supposed to be doing? So there's this real mismatch between like how the dashboard may be intended to use from like a researcher's perspective, from my perspective, or maybe from a more privacy-centered perspective, versus actually how they are received by end users to actually manage their data in any way, and will they actually be used for that purpose? And one of the reasons, like I said, that we thought this could be the case is that people don't have a good way to connect the dots from how data is actually used, have a good way to connect the dots between how data is actually used by Google to some end result of that. So what we thought is, like, let's repeat this experiment, but instead, let's actually think about what happens to that data, where does it end up in the pipeline, and the most likely place and the most obvious place is through advertising. So you collect data about you that gets into some telemetry. Google applies some machine learning model and says, hey, this person is interested in shoes. And then guess what? You get advertisements about shoes. So we're trying to see, like, okay, how do we connect the activity to some sort of advertising label that's actually applied by you, something that Google learns about you from doing this work? And if we can connect those dots, do we get a better, like a different result? Not necessarily better, but a different result in how people would be willing to manage their data, or particularly their perceived concern or benefit of that data collection. So to do this, we looked at Google's ad settings. So I'll just preface to say that Google's ad settings, since the study, has changed. So if you want to do follow-up work with me, there's a whole new ad universe of presenting this information that's ripe for exploration. I'm happy to talk about what to do next. But what the old ad settings did is they would show you a huge list of all the things that you're interested in. Some of these things are derived, so inferred advertisements based on your activity. Some of this is just things you told Google who you are. So I'm just curious, I mean, now I'm dating myself. How many people signed up for Google Plus social media when it came out? Yeah, a few of us. Guess what? Like, that was a failure as a social media, but it was a huge win for Google because all that information that you told Google about yourself went right into this advertising profile. So you could see things about like where you live. Also, you tell Google where you live, right? How many people have your home address typed into Google Maps so you can navigate home quickly? Everyone, because so now Google knows where you live, right? And all these other things. So some of these things are like things that you give Google very naturally, and some of these things are like inferred interests about you. So for example, like very generic, like maybe you like to shop for shirts, or very specific, like you're into construction and DIY stuff, or and many more below this. And again, like what we wanted to do here is look at how these activities relate directly to kinds of how Google infers it and the mental models that users have in that connection. So like the motivation is like, again, like privacy dashboards only display the raw data, right? And when we look at just the raw data, people don't understand it. So, and that's not really how the data is used. Like Google doesn't use data in raw form, it actually is going to process it. And so what we want to do is design an experiment where we connect the dots to see how people think this data is actually used. And if we engage them in that exercise of thinking of how this data is actually used, are they then more willing to manage their data? And or like, do they have different concern and benefit models around that data collection? And then we actually have this other kind of subcategory, which is kind of fun. It's like, how good are people at actually predicting what Google learns about them from a given activity? It turns out they're very bad at it, and for very interesting reasons. So we designed an online study. Again, we got 170 participants on Prolific. Again, we installed this custom browser extension. We did a pre and post study design, very similar to the last one. And in the task that I'll explain in 1 second, excuse me, what we had them do, we did a task in the middle. We asked them, again, their post-task perceptions, and then we exposed their full list of inferences afterwards to give them one last exposure to this is what Google actually infers about you. Now, this time for the task, what we did is we took out an actual activity that they did in their Google activity feed. So we used a similar extension. We grabbed an activity, we grabbed, I think, 9 of them in different categories. And then we asked them, hey, can you put in from this activity to say you watched a video about the 2022 Mazda CX-30. You could skip this activity if you thought it was too private or not interesting enough to warrant like some labeling. And then they would type in here some label for that video that would, like, for example, like cars, automobiles and vehicles, and so on and so forth. And we seeded this search here with the actual, what's called the verticals of Google's advertising network. So if you're an advertiser in Google, you can assign your advertisement, like AdWords, to assign to certain vertical names, like men between 34 and 40 that want to, I don't know, who like DIY, so that you can sell drills. I don't really know, but like you can like buy these verticals, and so like we just seeded this with verticals, and so people could either insert one of these verticals that they search for, but if they didn't find one of these verticals, they could also type in their own custom name for something. So essentially what we did is like, hey, imagine yourself as the Google algorithm for advertising. What do you think you learn from doing this one action on Google? Is kind of like the fundamental question that we're asking. And when we looked at what people typed into these things, and when we compared it to their actual, Google inferred interests, so what Google thinks they do, right? Their true interests, not their true life interests, but like Google inferred interests. What we find is that they're actually pretty bad at this task. So if you look at how many of them they actually put in, and we did some like customization to like group things together in case like they were very close, only 21% of the interest that they actually assigned to a given activity showed up in their actual Google inferred interests. So essentially, people are just not very good at figuring out what Google assigns their interest to based on looking at their own activities. A number of the activities were custom, but a massive 40% of those activities interests weren't in their actual inferred interest at all. So people are just really bad at reasoning about how Google infers interest about them, or like more specifically, they're very bad at figuring out what these interests are really going to be. And when we look, however, when we look at their pre and post tasks, the same question that we did again, we actually see it was 67% were at least sometimes concerned. And post-task, we also saw a very similar thing. In fact, we didn't see a difference in benefit. We saw a slight increase overall in benefit, but it was not significant, right? So actually, people's priors going into this were maintained. So they looked at the data that was collected about them, and then we did this task about like think about what Google learns about you, and then people say pretty much the same. Remember, in the last one, we saw a big jump in benefit. So in some ways, thinking about how Google uses this data kind of maintains a little bit more of the priors of how this works. And if you, when people talked about it, I wasn't fully aware of the data it collects about me, and then they went from sometimes to often, and I realized I benefit from some saved locations in Google. It wasn't as strong a reaction as last time. But when we then showed them their real Google ad interests, they actually kind of snapped back more fully to their priors. Because they looked at these ad interests, they're like, actually, those things aren't like super specific, super related to me. I'm not getting a huge amount of benefit. So they actually like kind of maintained throughout. So we didn't see this big shift in change. However, we saw a very different thing for concern. So we started out pre and post task, again, seeing roughly the same concern numbers, not significance, no significance here. But, and when we looked at what happened, we saw some like slightly concerned to sometimes concerned. I know some of the information they collect about me is for personalized ads. I'm unaware of anything else. And then like, it's kind of surprising that they can essentially take screenshots of everything. So they're like a little bit more concerned, but like, slightly somewhat versus some of these larger jumps we saw in the last one. However, when we show them after the Google ad inferences, we saw a big drop in concern. And just to remind you where we were at 62, 61% for somewhat concerned. But actually, when we show them their actual interests that Google learns about them, we see another huge drop all the way back down to 40% being concerned. And the reason for this is that when they look at these advertising interests, at first, I assumed that Google had collected lots of data and now worried about targeted ads. And then they look at these interests and they're like, these are really vague. And they're not really personal, and they're not really that interesting. And actually, this is really important idea here, because what's going on is that they applied to their advertising interests, they applied to their activities advertising interests that were highly specific, like highly personal. So they looked at this thing and they applied their own personal reasoning of their own understanding. And they're like, Google's going to learn that not only do I like cars, that I like Mazdas, right? And then they're like, label that activity with Mazdas. And then Google's like, I don't care if you like Mazdas, I'm going to try and sell you any kind of car on earth, right? Because the goal isn't to advertise to 10 people, it's to advertise to 10,000 people or 100,000 people. The highly specific aspects of the Google advertising interest is really not a benefit to Google. They're not selling pods of 10 people who want a specific car at a specific time and a specific price. They're trying to sell lots of eyeballs all at the same time. So the highly specific advertising inferences that these users think they needed to apply aren't actually that relevant to Google. But the more generic advertising interests are a lot more relevant to Google. And they have this kind of mismatch of things that are generic versus things that are specific. And we named this phenomenon, we call it the generic paradox, where people misplace the advertising inferences as overly generic, but somehow miss the forest for the trees, that a collection of relatively generic interests in their own perception creates a very specific view of an individual. So they look at everything individually rather than as a collection of information. It only takes a small number of generic interests to actually be very specific to you. And people's understanding of inferences also are not exactly one-to-one. So people want to connect their past online behaviors to one individual interest, but we also know that Google takes these collection of things and does second and third level inferences. And we show also there's a lot of misconceptions about what an individual inference is. They think when they apply their own logic, there's too literal, they're either over-specific, and they're not how the interactions are actually combined with other data. And finally, what we also observe is a bit of normalcy bias. So people would look at these advertising interests and they'll say something like, well, you know what, nothing bad has happened, right, by not taking any action, so I don't think anything bad's going to happen in the future. They've normalized the situation, they're kind of okay with it because they don't have any repercussions as a result. And so again, if our current understanding ambassadors are failing users, how do we design better ones? It's kind of more fundamentally. In some sense, these dashboards do help present and help people understand, but people still don't really know how to use them in an effective way. There's a lot of challenges to do that. And this is some ongoing work. Well, actually, it's kind of halted a little bit since all the students have graduated. But if you're interested in this problem, please please let me know, because this is definitely a space that I'm very interested in working in. So just to like switch gears a little bit, so in the first part of the talk, we're talking about how do we present data that's already been collected. Now we're going to think about like a little future focus, like how do we talk about people making decisions even before the data is collected? How do we communicate about a decision of like, do I use app A or do I use app B? Do I use service A or do I use service B? And how do we communicate about that ahead of time? Does that have an influence on users? So to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on privacy nutrition labels. So for those that, just to kind of, where does this kind of work come from? It starts really in the world of privacy policies. So I think everyone knows that privacy policy is that thing that's linked off a website that you never read. And then at some point they email you to say that they changed it and you don't read it after that as well. And that's really because there's just so many privacy policies. So back in the day, I think Lori Craner and Alicia McDonald like estimated that it would cost on the order of $781 billion to even review all of these privacy policies. So one of the ideas to simplify this process is to think a little bit about food labeling. So when you go to and buy a product in the store, they don't give you the recipe of like how it's made. They just tell you the facts, right? You know, they just tell you like this thing has this much sugar, this much fat, this much whatever. In the same way, you can think about synthesizing down a privacy policy into just the core ideas of like this information is being collected and it's going to be used in this way. And we call this a privacy nutrition label based kind of like from the world of food labeling. And it's been kind of really thought deeply about in the space of IoT. So the reason for this is that like oftentimes you buy an IoT device, you stick it on your wall or it's your fridge and you like it doesn't even have an interface, so you don't really know what's going on and you can't really interact with it in any meaningful way. So like you want to really apply labels to it so that people can actually make reasonable decisions about those products. And so it's been around the block for a while for IoT, and then kind of like out of nowhere, at least for a lot of people I know, in 2020, Apple announced that they're going to require something similar, which they call privacy labels, to all of their apps in the iOS App Store. So if you if you go to the App Store now in Apple, you can actually see the labels are somewhat prominently displayed about the kinds of data collection that a given app does. Now, importantly, these labels are self-selected by the developers. There's not a lot of verification by Apple itself, at least not that I'm aware of. And so Apple announced this, and then soon afterwards, so did Google. Google also calls them data safety labels. So in both major marketplaces, there are these labels that are supposed to describe the data privacy practices. And they look a little bit like this, just so you know. And we have a paper, we've been collecting these privacy labels for over 2 years. Every week, we do a complete scan of the Apple App Store, and we download all the labels, and we're building an observatory so that you can go look at it yourself and see any apps labels and like changes or dynamics of them as well. We've been trying to get this paper published for a long time. Hopefully very soon it will get in. And so just so you know how a label works, there's like higher order labels at the layer 1. So that's data used to track you, which is, according to Apple, it's really about advertising tracking. It's not like the app is like following you around, but like it's like advertising interests are tracking you. Data linked to you, so data that's collected that's linked to your identity. Data that's collected that's not linked to your identity. And then there's, these are called the privacy types, and these are the data categories, the kinds of labels. And finally, there's a fourth label type that's called data not collected. So this is it's mutually exclusive with the other three. So if you have data not collected, you can't have any of the other data types. So it's like 4 privacy types, 3 that have like sublayers, and then 1 that's like no data collected at all. And if you click further in, you can actually see the purposes of data collection. So like, for example, third-party advertising, that's what we're doing. And then the specific data types that are being collected, like precise location or coarse location, and so on and so forth. So it's actually a super complicated labeling scheme with many different labels going on, which is kind of surprising for a company that prides itself in simplicity. But there's like a lot of difficult comprehension and processes that are going on in here. And so, like I said, we've been collecting this data since July of 2021. So we're well past 2 years now. And there's roughly 1 to 2 million apps in the App Store at any given time. Actually, the number of apps are decreasing at the moment, which is kind of surprising to us. And we've been extracting these, and we're analyzing roughly a 2-year window. And so when you look at how these labels are actually presented, we see like a huge chunk of the labels are actually not collected at all. And then there's some like, Venn diagram intersection of other kind of label types that you see. And as you can see, if you look at the compliance ratio, so this top line are the total number of apps, and these are the apps that are coming into compliance. Even after 2 years, we still have like a quarter of the apps don't have a label at all. And that's because Apple didn't require you to like actually add your label immediately. They had a process by which if you wanted to update your app, like create a version update, you had to then add a label to your app. So like people slowly came into compliance as they updated the versions of the app. Of course, you can altruistically just update the metadata on the App Store and just add labels that way. And we still see also a large number of apps just simply say no data collected at all. Which is like essentially the de facto, like I don't know what to do right now, no data collected. And we actually think a lot. I mean, it's pretty obvious. A lot of these are probably doing some data collection. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Just a preview. And also, we see this general decrease in the number of apps on the App Store, and that has actually been explaining a lot of why these gaps are closing. Less so that people are coming in compliance, is that Apple is using this as a policy to actually try and remove apps that aren't being updated as regularly. And then you can do some interesting things with this data. So if you divide it up by free versus paid apps, we do see that free apps report more kinds of data collection than paid apps. And that makes sense, like a free app has to make money somehow overall. And we also just see a lot of no data collected in the paid apps. We don't really think they don't collect any data, but you can kind of see slight differences here. But one of the things we looked at immediately with this information, excuse me, is whether or not the apps how they updated and added labels to their data, labels to their apps, do they do so with or without prompting? So like I said before, if you can actually add labels to your app in 2 ways. One way you could add labels to your app is if you just wanted to update the metadata. So we call this like without being forced to do it. Versus you did a version update, and then if you did a version update of your app, you had to add labels to your app. And we broke down the data in these 2 ways, one with and one without a version update. We actually see relatively different distributions of how people select these labels, which suggested to us that like there is quite a bit of differences between those who are altruistically choosing to add labels like intentionally and versus those who were forced to do it, just as like kind of a general thing. And also we just saw like more than half of the apps that did it with a version update just said data not collected. They just like kind of opted out of the system completely. And so there's some anecdotal evidence that like here we are trying to force like users, force developers to communicate about their privacy practices, but they're probably not communicating it particularly well, right, at all. And we wanted to actually dive down a little bit into this and do it in a large scale to try and figure out how bad is it. So remember, this is supposed to be a synthesis of the privacy policies. So we actually downloaded 500,000 privacy policies, and we used the framework from Polissus, which is a NLP analyzer that actually can extract labels from privacy policies in free-form text. And then we took that, and we actually weren't able to get the original Polissus code because it turns out it was proprietary or owned by, I don't actually know where. And so we actually re-implemented it. We've actually re-implemented it twice, first in the original version, and then we re-implemented it with BERT, got some better numbers, and so on and so forth. And so we did this thing where we like extracted the privacy policies, we ran it through Polissus, we got these labelings, we came up with a matching process that was validated from Polissus labels to privacy labels, and then we tried to see like how good is this process overall. Lots of figures, lots of data. You don't have to actually fully understand this, but essentially we came up with this procedure, and what we found is that there's a big difference between what the policies say these apps do. Unsurprisingly, right? I think no one's surprised by this. Unsurprisingly, what the policies say these apps do versus what these apps claim to do in their labels. And so this is a little bit hard to read graph, but on the top side is what Polissus would say. On the bottom side is what the privacy label would say. And the hash marks, that's where they overlap. And one of the most immediate things you could see is that like In some categories, they're actually not so bad. Like, you have very similar distributions for data used to track you and data used to link you, but you also have like some very wide gaps, particularly in the data linked to you and the data not collected. In particular, the Polissus analysis says only 1% of the apps actually have a privacy policy that say they don't collect any data, while the labels would say 39% of the apps would feel that way, which is like totally wild. Versus again, like here, something like 94% roughly of the apps we analyzed would do some sort of data linked to you in some capacity, while the labels would only say it would be 42%. So pretty wide misunderstandings of the labels, or some pretty wide intentional misuse of the labels potentially as well. And we had some reasons for why this might be going on. I don't think it's actually malicious. I think a lot of it is misunderstanding and confusion because the labels are actually somewhat complicated. But also there's like there's some other factors that are going on in this world that is worth considering. So one of them is like, I'm just going to pick on one relatively large company called Subsplash. So Subsplash is a platform that helps like restaurants and other people quickly develop an app that they can put on the marketplace really quickly. It's so like, you think about it as WordPress for apps, right? So you don't have to know how to build an app. You can just get Subsplash to do it and you hire them out. And if you look at their Subsplash app, their main one, like they have data not linked to you. I'm not going to call it any company that they work for, but they have many, many apps on the store with like this that are just like this. And in their privacy policy, they explicitly say, when you interact with Subsplash, we may collect personal information relevant to your situation. So like right there, they definitely say they may collect data about you, but yet they say they don't collect any data about you. So, and this Subsplash has 8,000 apps that they help develop on the App Store that have some issues with it. Similarly, we have issues with template privacy policy. So like if you're some person and you are required, like just a random student, you want to put an app on the App Store and you need a privacy policy, how many of you have written a privacy policy before? I know there's at least one lawyer in the room, but most of you are not lawyers, I'm assuming, right? So how do you actually go about getting a privacy policy? Like, it's not really malicious here. So you Google template privacy policy. Can I get a privacy policy that I can use on my app? And so when we Googled all these template privacy policies, there's a lot of them out there that you can find. There's like thousands and thousands of these template privacy policies. And we did like some very textual comparison. And we found many of these template privacy policies are used verbatim or very close to verbatim in a number of apps in order to fulfill this regulatory requirement that Apple allows. And a lot of these are also then misaligned with like what the app's labelings actually are. Because like developers are not experts in this space. Like maybe we shouldn't expect them to be, right? So there's a lot of issues going on. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding of both from the developer perspective, like how do I actually apply these privacy policies, privacy labels based on the policy of Apple as they want me to apply them. And also misunderstanding from the user perspective, do they even use these things in any particular way to actually make decisions? My guess is not a single person here has ever decided not to install an app because of the privacy label. If you have, I'm very curious to talk to you, okay? Because like when you're installing an app, you're like, dude, like I need the parking app for Bochum because I have to like park my car and pay for it. I can't use alternative app B that doesn't collect data about me. I have to use the parking app for this place. Like you don't have a choice. It's very rare that you actually have a choice in the apps that you're choosing. So it kind of like begs this question, like, what's the point of all this? Like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we going through this exercise to force developers to not know what they're doing and applying labels that are clearly wrong in many cases? Who is this serving, right? And the same question is, what are these mechanisms serving? Who benefits from these processes, right? In some sense, like I want to give Google a lot of credit, like actually sharing this information, building these dashboards, it's the right thing to do. But clearly it's good for Google, right? Because it makes people less concerned overall. And we don't know how to use it, and we don't know how to manage our data properly, and it's pushing the burden onto us. In the same way, Apple is forcing developers to use this thing. In some sense, it's a very good thing. I want to know more about how my apps are using my data, but how do I actually make choices in the systems? How do I trust the system? And how do I know that developers are actually doing this right? I don't think they're trying to avoid this maliciously. I think it's just, frankly, hard. It's just a hard process, you know. It's not easy to do this correctly. And so in this world, like I'm going to leave you without solutions, which I think is always a good talking point. It's like, why are we doing all this? Who is this serving, right? It's definitely, I think, serving Google. I think it's definitely serving Apple. I think they're serving them in different ways. I think it's serving Apple because they make themselves look good, right? They're like, we're the privacy company. They're definitely collecting all the same data as Google is, and they're using it for advertising in the same way. But they get to advertise that they're taking action on these things. And they also get to use it as a regulatory, like a shadow regulatory framework within the Apple Store to find developers that are out of compliance, for example. So there's a lot of things that are going on here in this, is the end user actually benefiting from all these products, which is kind of a fundamental question that I'm thinking a lot about. And kind of moving forward, how do we do this better? I don't know. I mean, I want to find out. I mean, this is kind of where I am. How do we do this better? And there's significant challenges, right? We have to come up against normalcy bias. People don't make different decisions if they don't understand the risks involved, right? Because they haven't experienced something bad happening. There's also this generic paradox that we identified that people think their data is relatively generic, right? The things that are learned about them while they're rather specific. It's just overwhelming to manage all of these things. It's a large ecosystem. And there's a fallacy of choice. How many of you are going to stop? I mean, maybe in Germany I could ask this question and I'll have some hand raised. But how many of you are going to really stop using Google Maps? I know you. I'm not. It's great. Frankly, it's a great product. Why should I harm myself, right? It's a feeling that a lot of people might have, right? To not use these things. And there's a lot of issues around accuracy and transparency of the process. If we're going to force users to make decisions, how do I trust what I'm getting back, right? If we're going to put the burden somewhere else. And so where we're going in this space, I'm thinking more about how do we design better privacy management tools? How do we try and get people's priors about what they want to do to actually be reflected in the dashboard in which they actually work? And then more about accountability and transparency. Can we make suggestions about what kinds of labels really should be there? We have this infrastructure now. We're trying to build an observatory where you can actually look at the distinctions and what's going on. All sorts of fun stuff. Let me know if you're interested. Again, I did not do any of this on my own, even though I'm very excited about it. It takes a team of wonderful collaborators to make this work, and I'm very happy to have worked with such great people. So I thank you again, and that's where we're at this point. So thanks a lot.